The first thing I noticed was the blood. Not because there was a lot of it, though there was, more than I'd ever seen outside of a trauma bay, but because of where it stopped. See, blood follows rules. Gravity, pressure, the architecture of torn tissue. I've been a field medic for 11 years across 3 conflict zones, and I knew what blood looked like when it was doing what blood does. I knew the patterns, the pooling, the way it darkens at the edges when it's been sitting for a few minutes, the way fresh arterial spray makes almost a mist in cold air. This blood had stopped in a perfect circle. 2 inches from his skin, just stopped, like it hit an invisible wall and gave up. I remember standing there in the processing bay of Forward Station Karev 9, holding my scanner like an idiot, just staring at the circle of knot blood around this man on the table, and thinking, I have made a serious error in my understanding of physics. His name, the name we eventually learned, was Emric Salas. But that comes later. First, let me tell you about the morning it all started, because that matters too. Context always matters, and this story, if you're going to understand any of it, needs its context laid down properly before the impossible parts start stacking up. My name is Corporal Yara Denholm, and on the morning of March 4th, 2387, I was trying to drink coffee out of a container that had been designed by someone who clearly hated the concept of not spilling. Karev 9 was what the brass called a transitional forward operating base, which was military language for a place that was meant to be temporary, but had somehow been there for 9 years, and had developed its own postal code. It sat on the edge of the Haverson Expanse, that stretch of dead desert planet that nobody had wanted until the Dominion Survey Corps found crystallized Jutanite deposits under the crust, at which point suddenly everyone wanted it very badly. The base had 3 med bays, a landing strip that could accommodate vessels up to Class 7 tonnage, approximately 412 personnel at any given time, and 1 coffee machine that I genuinely believed was possessed by something malevolent. I was fighting with the coffee machine when Sergeant Pryor walked in. Denholm. 1 second. Denholm, we've got incoming. I turned around. Pryor had that look on his face, the one where his jaw was doing the thing it did when the information he was carrying was too weird for his features to organize properly. He was a 15-year veteran who had pulled people out of burning dropships and talked down 3 different hostage situations. It took a lot to make his face do that. What kind of incoming? I asked. The weird kind. That was actually a technical category at Karev 9. We had a log. Weird incoming had its own column. How weird? He thought about it for a second. Weirder than the thing with Lieutenant Marsh's arm. That was very weird. The thing with Lieutenant Marsh's arm had involved 2 physicists, a xenobiologist, and a 40-minute argument about whether what they were looking at was technically possible under the known laws of the universe. The consensus had been, probably not, but here we are. I put down my coffee container. Show me. The landing pad was 40 meters from the med bay entrance, and I was pulling on gloves the whole way there. The sun on Karev 9 was this particular shade of pale yellow that always made things look slightly washed out, like an old photograph of something that used to be vivid. The air smelled like mineral dust and the recycled oxygen funk that you got near the filtration vents. There was already a crowd. Not a crowd like a party, a crowd like the kind that forms when something is wrong and everyone knows it, but nobody wants to be the first to say so out loud. Personnel standing at odd angles, not looking directly at the landing pad, but also not looking away. The body language of people who were trying to seem like they weren't watching while absolutely watching. On the pad there was a ship. Or there had been a ship. What was there now was the suggestion of a ship, a frame, the structural skeleton of a vessel that had, at some point recently, experienced catastrophic hull compromise at roughly 80% of its external surface area. The thing that was left was the inner cage, the load-bearing ribs of whatever the original craft had been. And it was twisted in a way that made my eyes water slightly when I tried to follow the geometry of it. And sitting in the center of it, in what had probably been the cockpit before the cockpit stopped existing, was a man. He was conscious. That was the first impossible thing. Dr. Con Reese was already there when I arrived. He was our chief medical officer, a small, intense man who had the energy of someone who had been told he was dying 20 years ago and had decided to personally spite the diagnosis by working himself into the ground on other people's problems instead. He had his scanner out and was looking at it, and then looking at the man in the wreck, and then looking at the scanner again, in a loop, with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. "Doctor," I said, coming up beside him. "Denholm," he didn't look at me, "tell me what you see." I looked at the man in the wreck. He was human-looking. That was my first assessment, and it was wrong, but I didn't know it was wrong yet. He looked like a man, 6 feet, maybe 6'1". Built, not bodybuilder built, but the kind of built that comes from use rather than effort, the unconscious musculature of someone who just did things. Brown hair, cut short. Wearing something that wasn't quite clothes in any way I recognized, dark material, close-fitting, with no visible seams or fasteners, which my brain filed under unusual and moved past. His face was calm, not calm like someone unconscious, calm like someone waiting. His eyes were open. They were looking at us. "He's conscious," I said, unnecessary, but I needed to say it. "He has been conscious since the ship entered our sensor range approximately 19 minutes ago," Reese said. "The ship was traveling at velocity consistent with a controlled crash approach. He appears to have guided it down manually." He paused. "There is currently no navigational system remaining in that vessel. There is no autopilot. The computational core was destroyed. We can see the debris field in his approach path, about 40 kilometers out. He flew that ship to this exact location, manually, with no guidance systems, in the dark, at terminal velocity, and he survived." I looked at the wreck again, at the man in it. "He's not galactic assembly?" I asked. "No identifying transponder, no known registry. The hull composition, what's left of it, doesn't match any material in our database." "Dominion." "No." "Then who?" "That," Reese said, finally looking at me, "is what I am hoping you will help me figure out. Because I've now run the passive bioscan 3 times, and it keeps giving me results I don't understand, and I'm starting to think the scanner might be broken, except that would require the scanner to be broken in a very specific and narratively convenient way, and I don't believe in narratively convenient scanner failures." I took my own scanner out, pointed it at the man. "Ran the scan. Read the results." "Read them again." "Doctor," I said. "Yes." "Is this?" "I don't know. It says his cellular." "I know what it says." "That's not possible." "I'm aware." We stood there for a moment in the pale yellow sunlight, listening to the wind move through the skeletal ribs of the impossible ship, and the man in the cockpit watched us with calm, dark eyes, and didn't move, and didn't speak, and breathed in the slow, measured way of someone who had decided that whatever happened next, they were going to meet it with patience. We moved him to Med Bay 1. I say moved like it was a normal process. It was not a normal process. It was 14 minutes of very careful structural assessment of the wreck, 2 attempts to pass equipment through the debris that failed because the angles were wrong, 1 moment where Private Lassiter tried to use a plasma cutter on a section of hull, and the plasma cutter made contact and then stopped working, as if it had thought better of the whole enterprise, and finally a solution involving 3 people, a repurposed tow cable from the vehicle bay, and a great deal of improvisation. Through all of this, the man watched. He didn't struggle. He didn't help. He watched with that same patient attention, like someone watching a play they'd already seen, and were curious to see how this particular cast would perform it. When we finally got him clear of the wreck and onto a hover gurney, I leaned over him to do a quick assessment, and he spoke for the first time. "You're a healer," he said. Not a question, a statement. And the thing was, he said it in standard, perfect standard, no accent I could place. But the word he used for me wasn't doctor or medic, it was healer. "I'm a medic," I said. "Corporal Denholm, you're at Forward Station Karev 9. Can you tell me your name?" He considered this question very carefully, the way you'd consider a question that was more complicated than it appeared. "Emric," he said finally. "My designation name is Emric." "Just Emric." A slight pause. "Salas, Emric Salas." "Emric, I'm going to need to examine you. You were in a significant impact event. Are you in pain?" He seemed to think about this too. Like the concept of pain was something he was checking against his internal inventory. "No," he said, and then quieter, like he was saying it to himself, "Not anymore." Medbay 1 had the best equipment on the station, which is to say it was 4 years old and had been refurbished twice, and the holographic display panel on the secondary unit had a flicker that Dr. Reese had been submitting maintenance requests about for 8 months. But it had a full-spectrum bioscanner, a trauma unit, and enough diagnostic equipment to get a solid read on most biological life forms we were likely to encounter in this sector. Most. I got Emric Salas onto the primary table and started the full-body assessment, while Reese pulled up the preliminary passive scan results on the display. Lieutenant Ferris, our xenobiology consultant, had been rousted from her morning shift and was standing in the corner with a data tablet, already looking like someone who was very glad they'd gotten into this field. "Okay," I said, running the wand of the bioscanner from his head downward. "Let's do this properly." The results started coming in. "Skeletal structure," I read aloud because talking through it helped me process. "Mostly consistent with human baseline. Density, Dr. Reese, are you seeing this density reading?" "I'm seeing it." "That's more than double standard human." "Yes." Emric's bones were more than twice as dense as a human skeleton. Not heavier in the way that would indicate pathology, the distribution was even, natural-looking in the imaging. Just more material, more structure. "Musculature," I continued, "consistent with human, but," I frowned. "The fiber ratio is off. Dr. Reese, what am I looking at here? This reads as, are those fast-twitch fibers?" "The ratio is approximately 70% fast-twitch to 30% slow-twitch," Reese said. "Which, in a standard human, would result in a body that was extraordinarily fast, but had essentially no endurance capacity. But the distribution pattern suggests he has both. It suggests his biology has found a way to have both, which should not be physiologically possible under the muscle architecture we understand." Lieutenant Ferris made a quiet sound from her corner. "Can I?" "Please," I said, gesturing her forward. She came and looked at the scanner output over my shoulder. Her eyes moved rapidly across the data. "This fiber structure," she said slowly, "reminds me of something. There's a theoretical paper, Dr. Ilyash's work on predivergence humanoid variants. She described what she called optimized biological architecture in fossil records. The idea being that some ancient humanoid populations may have had biological structures that modern humans have since." She stopped herself. "Actually, let me not speculate. Let's just keep reading the data." I kept reading the data. Cardiovascular system, unusual. Heart appears to have 2 distinct pumping chambers that don't correspond to standard 4-chamber anatomy. There's a secondary rhythm here that I can't interpret. It looks almost like Dr. Reese. Reese came and looked. He was quiet for a long time. "That secondary rhythm," he said finally, "appears to be pumping something other than blood." We all looked at Emric. Emric looked back at us with those calm dark eyes and said nothing. The blood itself, I said, moving the scan results to the biochemical panel. Though I stopped. The blood panel was where things started to get genuinely strange. Not just unusual, strange. Human blood is a fairly well-understood medium. Red cells, white cells, platelets, plasma, known proteins, known markers. We can read a blood panel from a human being and build a fairly detailed picture of their biology, their history, their health status. Emric Salaz's blood panel was reading like something translated from another language by someone who understood most of the words but not quite all of them. The underlying architecture was recognizable. There were red cell analogs. There were protein structures that had human equivalents. There was something functioning as plasma. But threaded through it, woven into the cellular level in a way I'd never seen, was something else. The scanner labeled it Unknown Compound 12, which meant it had found 12 separate compounds it had no reference for. 12, I said. 12, Reese confirmed. What are they doing? I don't know, but look at the distribution. They're not clustered, they're system-wide, every tissue sample, every cellular read, they're everywhere. Ferris over my shoulder again. They look like they're integrated. Like they're not foreign compounds, they're part of the biology, like they grew there. I looked at Emric again. Emric, I said, we're finding some readings that we don't have references for. I want to be honest with you, we're not sure what we're looking at. Do you have any medical history you can share with us? Any information about your physiology that might help us understand what we're seeing? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How old does your equipment think I am?" I looked at the scanner results. The biological age assessment was one of the standard outputs, derived from cell telomere length and a dozen other markers. I'd glossed over it because it had come back with an error code I'd assumed was a malfunction. I looked at it again. The error code wasn't a malfunction. It was the scanner's way of saying, I have run this calculation, and the result is outside my operational parameters. Below it in small text, estimated biological age, unable to determine. Telomere analysis indicates subject may be older than system's maximum reference age. The system's maximum reference age was 200 years. I looked at Emric Salaz, who looked like a man in his mid-30s. How old are you? I asked. He tilted his head slightly, not evasively, thoughtfully. That's a question, he said, with a complicated answer. We stabilized him. That's the clinical word. In practice, what we did was admit that there was nothing obviously wrong with him that we could treat, because everything we'd found so far was different rather than damaged, and we weren't going to inject substances into a body we didn't understand based on a scan we couldn't interpret. Reese pulled me into his office while Ferris stayed with Emric. The office was small and stacked with physical data tablets. Reese was one of those people who printed things, because he said staring at screens for 12 hours a day was already enough, and he needed the tactile difference of paper to think. The walls had atmospheric readings taped to them, various planetary charts, a photograph of a woman I'd never asked about. Tell me your assessment, Reese said, dropping into his chair. I stayed standing. I don't have one, not a clean one. Give me the dirty one. I thought about how to say it. His biology reads as human in the way that a translation reads as the original. The structure is there. The framework is recognizable. But something has been done to it, or something has happened to it, or it's like the human baseline has been. I couldn't find the word. Refined, Reese said quietly. Yes. Optimized. Yes. Improved across every measurable axis to a degree that is not achievable through any medical or genetic technology we currently possess, or that anyone in the assembly currently possesses, or that anyone in any civilizational record we have access to currently possesses. He paused. And yet here he is, sitting on our exam table, breathing our recycled air, speaking our language, looking at us like we're the most interesting thing he's seen in a while. He might just be being polite, I said. Reese didn't smile. Ferris's paper reference, Ilyash's pre-divergence work. I know that paper. And it's considered fringe. The archaeological record it references, the samples that showed unusual biological markers, were dismissed by the mainstream xenoarchaeology community as contaminated. Ilyasha spent most of her career defending it and retired without consensus. He picked up a data tablet, turned it over in his hands. But the markers she described in the fossil record, the ones she said indicated a level of biological optimization that shouldn't have been possible in populations from that era. He looked at me. They match, I said. They match, he confirmed. The office felt smaller than it had a minute ago. If the scanner age estimate is even approximately correct, I said, if he is genuinely older than 200. The fossil samples Ilyasha was working with were dated to the interregnum period, pre-galactic assembly, pre-contact, roughly 12 to 15,000 years before. He's not 12,000 years old, I said, firmly, because the alternative was too large to hold in the room with us. Reese looked at the tablet. No, probably not, a pause, though we don't actually know that. I went back to the med-bay. Ferris was sitting in the chair next to Emrich's table, and they were talking. Not the careful, clinical talk of a doctor and patient, the kind of conversation that happens when two people have found common ground on something unexpected. Ferris was leaning forward slightly. Emrich was looking at her with genuine attention. They both looked up when I came in. He speaks Veshti, Ferris said. Veshti was an extinct language. Not recently extinct. The last known native speakers had died approximately 600 years ago. It was a linguistic relic, studied by historians, preserved in archaeological archives. I know some Veshti, I said, which was an overstatement. I knew of Veshti, which is not the same as knowing it. He speaks it correctly, Ferris said. I mean, I only know about 40 words, but the ones he used, the pronunciation, the grammatical structure, it's not textbook Veshti. It's living, Emrich said simply. It was living when I learned it. We were quiet. When did you learn it? I asked. He considered. I would have to calculate the equivalent in your calendar. It would take some time. Take the time, I said. He did. His eyes went somewhere internal for a moment, not unfocused, but directed inward, like someone running a calculation. Then he said a number. The number was not 600. The number was not in the hundreds at all. I am not going to write the number here in this account, because I didn't believe it when he said it, and I'm not sure I believe it now. And writing it down would make it feel more real than I'm ready for it to be. What I will say is that Ferris made a sound like someone had pressed all the air out of her, and sat back in her chair, and looked at Emrich Salas with an expression that was equal parts scientific hunger and pure human terror. And Emrich looked back at her with that same patient calm and said, I know, I'm sorry, it's a lot to receive. The blood. I keep coming back to the blood, because that's where the science stopped making polite excuses and started breaking down entirely. After that first conversation, Reese requested a physical blood sample, with Emrich's consent, which he gave without hesitation, holding out his arm in a matter-of-fact way that suggested he'd done this many times before, in many different places, for many different people. The needle made contact with his skin. It didn't quite penetrate. Not because his skin was hard or visibly resistant. The needle just met a subtle resistance and then slid sideways, the way a magnet will slide away from the same pole of another magnet. Reese tried twice with slightly different angles. On the third attempt, Emrich said, May I? And took the needle, adjusted something, I couldn't see what, with his other hand, and then placed the needle at a specific point on his inner arm. This time it went in cleanly. "What did you just do?" Reese asked. "Lowered the threshold," Imric said, like that was a normal thing to say. The blood that came out was red. That was the first normal thing. It was red in a slightly different way than human blood, richer, maybe deeper, but red. Reese processed it through the analyzer, and we stood and watched the results come up in real time. The 12 unknown compounds were there, as expected. But now that we were doing a direct contact analysis rather than a passive scan, the detail resolution was higher. "These three," Ferris said, pointing at the analysis display. "These three have analogs, distant ones but analogs. Look, this structure here resembles a modified telomere maintenance protein. And this one looks like a synthetic immune modulator," Reese finished. "But the scale of modification is extraordinary," Ferris said. "I was going to say impossible." "Same thing," Ferris said, and she wasn't really joking. What the analysis was beginning to suggest, in the careful clinical language of scanner outputs and compound breakdowns, was that Imric Salaz's blood contained a suite of biological technologies, not separate technologies, not implants, not injections, but integrated biological structures that functioned like machinery at the cellular level. Things that regulated his aging. Things that maintained his tissue integrity. Things that operated on his immune response in ways that would make any pathogen that tried to take hold in his body face something considerably more sophisticated than a normal immune system. Things that, incidentally, might explain why the blood outside his body was behaving strangely. Some kind of electromagnetic field effect generated by the compounds themselves, keeping debris and foreign matter away from open injuries. "Someone built this," Reese said quietly, looking at the display. "Someone or something designed this biology, engineered it, at a cellular level so fundamental that it can't be separated from the natural biology it's woven in. It's part of him as much as his own cells are part of him." We all looked at Imric. "Yes," Imric said, because he could clearly hear us, and because he understood what we were getting to. "Who?" I asked. The first trace of something that wasn't patience moved across his face. Not pain exactly, not grief. Something older than both. "My people," he said, "a very long time ago." That evening, Reese sent a priority communication to the Galactic Assembly Medical Research Division. He sent it under a classification code I hadn't seen him use before. A code that, I later found out, was reserved for discoveries of potential Category 1 xenobiological significance. While he was doing that, I stayed with Imric. There was no medical reason for me to stay. He was stable, was beyond stable in fact, was probably the most biologically robust patient I'd ever had on my table. But I stayed, because I wanted to, because there was something about being in the room with him that felt like standing at the edge of a very large thing, and not knowing whether you were about to fall or fly. We talked. Not about the biology for a while, about simpler things. He asked about Karev 9, how long it had been operational, what we were doing there, what the local conditions were like. He asked with genuine curiosity, the way someone asks when they're actually interested and not just being polite. I answered, and then, because sitting on questions was never something I'd been good at. "The ship, the one you came in on, what happened to it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was in a conflict," he said finally. "With who?" "The Vel Anat." The name meant nothing to me. I said so. "They wouldn't be in your records," he said. "They don't have a name in your language yet. In mine, they're the Vel Anat, a species military in structure, expansionist in philosophy. They've been present in this region of space for the last few centuries, growing, testing borders. We haven't encountered them." "You would have," he said, "soon, if things had continued as they were." He paused. "I've been, monitoring the situation, trying to prevent an escalation that would have brought them to assembly space faster than the assembly was prepared to deal with them. Alone. A slight complicated expression, mostly. I thought about what that meant, the scope of what that meant. A single person monitoring and managing a potential civilizational threat alone for how long? Years, decades. Emric, I said, when you say your people built your biology, engineered you, essentially, where are they now? The old expression again. The one beyond grief and past pain. Gone, he said. How? The same way everything goes, he said. Eventually. He looked at the ceiling of the med bay, at the recycled air vents and the flickering panel that Reese could never get fixed. They were remarkable. They built things that lasted. They built me and I've lasted. A pause. But they built other things too, and some of those things. He didn't finish the sentence. Emric. Some of what they built, he said quietly, is what the Vel Anod have been trying to find. He slept that night, or something like sleep. His vital signs shifted into a lower rhythm, his eyes closed, and his body went still in the particular way of genuine unconsciousness rather than rest. But the monitors showed brain activity that was nothing like sleep, structured and purposeful, like someone working through a complex problem in the dark. I wrote my incident report. I sat at the desk outside Med Bay 1 and wrote the most unusual incident report of my 11-year career, and I kept having to stop because I'd write something down and then read it back and it would sound like I'd made it up. So I'd go back and try to find more clinical language, and the clinical language would make it sound worse, so I'd try again. Eventually I just wrote what I saw, what the scanner showed, what he said, flat and factual and completely, utterly impossible. I sent it to Reese. His response came back 12 minutes later. Mine looks exactly the same. I also included the blood panel. Let them figure out the language. And then, after a pause, another message. Get some sleep, Denholm. Tomorrow is going to be strange. I didn't sleep much. Tomorrow was an understatement. The Galactic Assembly response came in at 3:40 station time, which meant someone in the research division had been awake, or someone had flagged the communication as urgent enough to wake someone up. Either way, what came back was not the standard acknowledgement and hold that we usually got for priority comms. What came back was Dr. Orvin Tessick, in person, on a live channel, with 3 other people visible behind her who were very clearly scientists trying to look calm while radiating the opposite. Dr. Tessick was the director of the Assembly's Xenobiological Heritage Division. I knew her name from journals. She was not someone who personally responded to field communications at 3:40. Corporal Denholm, she said, is Dr. Reese available? Reese was already there. He'd come in when the response alert sounded. He looked like he'd slept about as much as I had. Dr. Tessick, he said, thank you for responding. I've read your report 3 times, she said, and the blood panel twice, and I have Dr. Ilyasha's paper pulled up on my secondary screen, which I imagine tells you something about my current state of mind. Dr. Ilyasha, Farah said softly, from her position against the wall. Reese glanced at her. She looked like someone who had just been told something they'd always suspected but never expected to be confirmed. The markers you've described, Tessick continued. The compound signatures, the biological optimization profile, the scanner age ceiling breach. She paused. We need to see him. We need to, another pause. Is he communicative, cooperative? Extremely, I said. Has he said anything about where he came from, what he is? I looked at Reese. Reese looked at me. He said his people are gone, I said. He said he's been operating alone in this sector, and he referenced a group called the Vel Anod, a potentially hostile species that may be approaching assembly space. Tessick's face did several things at once. That name, she said carefully, appears in one document in our classified archives, 1. From approximately 90 years ago. A field report from a survey vessel that made brief contact with an unidentified species in the outer Haverson region before losing communications. The document was classified because the contact report was too incomplete to verify, and because the species description matched nothing in the database, and because the survey vessel. She stopped. Was lost, Reese said. Was lost, she confirmed, with all hands. We were quiet for a moment, across the light minutes of space between us. Dr. Tessick, Reese said, I want to be clear about something. Our patient is cooperative and communicative and appears to have chosen to come here deliberately. He guided a destroyed ship to this exact location. He is not a prisoner. He is not a threat. Whatever decisions are made about next steps, his autonomy needs to. Of course, Tessick said, and she meant it. I could hear it. I'm not interested in him as a subject, Dr. Reese. I'm interested in him as, she seemed to search for the word, as a survivor. The morning brought three things. First, Emrich's ship, which several engineering personnel had been carefully attempting to document overnight, suddenly compacted itself. Not violently, not an explosion or a collapse, but a slow, deliberate reduction, like a fist closing. The exterior debris field, the shrapnel and hull fragments, the scattered components that had been distributed across the landing pad, all of it moved, slowly and without apparent mechanism, back toward the central frame, and the frame folded in on itself, and in approximately 20 minutes there was a cube of compressed material approximately 1 meter on a side sitting on the landing pad. The cube was warm to the touch. It hummed faintly at a frequency that was slightly below hearing. Second, Emrich woke up, looked at the med bay ceiling and said, I need to tell you something about what's coming. Third, a Vel Anat scout vessel dropped out of transit approximately 800 kilometers from Karev 9 atmospheric boundary and held position there, not transmitting, not approaching, just waiting. In 11 years, I'd never had a morning with three things like that. Most mornings you were lucky to get one. Part 2. Let me tell you about the moment the scanner showed us what he actually was. Not the blood panel, not the age estimate, not the tissue analysis or the compound breakdown or any of the incremental strangeness that had been accumulating since the previous morning. The moment. It happened at 9:12 station time, with Dr. Tessick patched in on a live feed from Assembly Headquarters, with Ferris and Reese both present, with Private Lassiter standing at the med bay entrance for reasons that were officially security protocol, and unofficially, everyone in the station wanted to be near this room. Reese had set up the high-resolution deep tissue scanner, the one we usually used for complex internal injuries, the one that took 20 minutes to warm up and required a calibration sequence, and produced imaging data at a level of detail that was almost unsettling. He'd argued that the standard passive scanner was giving us incomplete information, and that we needed the full-resolution read to properly understand what we were working with. Emrich had agreed. He'd lain still for the warm-up period, which he'd spent looking at the ceiling and occasionally saying things in languages that neither I nor Ferris nor Reese could identify. Not to us, just quietly, to himself, like someone going through a mental checklist in their first language. The scout vessel outside was still holding position. Emrich had, in the hour before the scan, told us some of what was coming. Not everything. I had the impression he was choosing what to tell us carefully, not out of deception but out of a kind of consideration. He was thinking about what we could hold, what would help versus what would overwhelm. What he'd told us was this. The Vel Anat were not a random expansionist species. They were looking for something specific. They had been looking for it for approximately 300 years. They had tracked its location across 17 star systems, moving through them in a pattern that had the logic of a search grid if you knew what you were looking at, which nobody in the assembly had, because nobody in the assembly had known what to look for. What they were looking for was him. Not Imrik Saleh specifically. They didn't know his name, didn't have his face. They were looking for evidence of his people. The civilization that had, 12,000 years ago, developed biological engineering technology that made the current state of the art look like finger painting. The civilization that had, before they disappeared, seeded certain things into the universe. Hidden things. Archive things. Things that were stored in only one remaining place. Me, Emmerich had said very simply. The archive was him. Whatever his people had known, the biological sciences, the physics, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had been old when humanity was learning to make fire, it was in him. Not in a data chip or an external storage medium. In his cells. In the 12 unknown compounds. In the structures that his blood carried and his body maintained. He was a library. He was the last library. "Why are you here?" Ferris had asked. She'd meant here Karev 9 specifically, this station this morning. "Because you were going to encounter them," he'd said, "the Vel Anat. You were going to encounter them within 18 months in this sector without knowing what they were or what they wanted, and the encounter was not going to go well for you." He'd paused. "I've watched that scenario play out with other species. I prefer not to watch it again." "So you came here to warn us," Reese had said. "Yes." "And to what? Help us fight them?" Emmerich had looked at Reese with that particular expression. Not condescension, never condescension, but something like the expression of someone watching a child try to pick up something very heavy and trying to figure out how to be helpful without being insulting. "I came here," he'd said carefully, "to give you a choice. That's all, just a choice." The deep scanner took its 20 minutes to warm up. We spent them setting up the display calibration, double-checking the resolution parameters, making sure the live feed to Tessic and her team was stable. Emmerich lay still and watched us work with the patient attention I'd come to recognize as simply his baseline mode of being in the world. When the scan began, the results populated in real time on the holographic display above the table, a three-dimensional model of his interior that built itself layer by layer, from skin to bone to organ to cellular level. At the structural level, we saw what we'd already seen in the passive scan: dense bones, unusual musculature, the modified cardiovascular system with its two-rhythm pumping. Then the scanner went deeper, to the cellular level, and then below the cellular level to the molecular. And then the display changed. It didn't glitch. It didn't show an error. The scanner was functioning perfectly. I could see the processing load on the system display, the data flowing in at normal rates. What was happening was that the scanner was seeing correctly, and what it was seeing correctly was something that took the display panel approximately 45 seconds to render, because it was so structurally complex that the rendering algorithm had to work through it piece by piece. What it showed at the molecular level, threaded through every tissue, every organ, every cell, was a network. Not a biological network in the way we use that word for nervous systems or vascular systems. A design network, a lattice. Geometric in a way that living tissue simply is not, but woven so thoroughly into the living tissue that it could not be separated from it. The 12 unknown compounds were nodes in this lattice. The network connected them, ran between them, pulsed with a rhythm that was not quite biological and not quite mechanical. Ferris made a sound. Reese said, "Oh." "Tessic, on the live feed, are you seeing?" "Yes," Reese said. "All of it. All of it." I said nothing. I just looked at the display and felt something tectonic shift in the way I understood the universe. The network was, I'm going to use this word and acknowledge that it's inadequate writing. Not literally, not in any alphabet I knew. But the lattice had a structure that was unmistakably intentional and unmistakably linguistic. Pattern within pattern within pattern, recursive and self-similar, encoding something that was too compressed to be random noise and too elaborate to be simple biology. "It's information," Tessick said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's a storage medium. He's a biological data storage medium." "That's what I said," Emmerich confirmed mildly. "But the density, the amount of information that could be encoded in a lattice of this size and complexity, that's significant," Emmerich said. "I was going to say incalculable." A slight pause, that too. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense medical scientific session I'd ever witnessed. Tessick brought in 2 additional researchers via the live feed, Dr. Pavana from the Biological Physics Institute, and a man whose name I didn't catch who worked in some classified division of the Assembly Science Directorate and kept looking like he wanted to be somewhere else and simultaneously like he never wanted to leave. They asked questions. Emmerich answered them, in the patient, careful way he'd been answering since the beginning, choosing his words, considering what to share. "We learned things." His people were called the HFY. The name meant, approximately, those who remember, not in the sense of recalling things from the past, but in the sense of being custodians of memory. It was a name they'd given themselves late in their civilization, when they'd understood what they were becoming, not just an advanced species, but an archival one, a species that was deliberately and systematically encoding everything they knew into forms that would outlast the ordinary vulnerabilities of civilization. The HFY had been gone for 12,000 years. Not killed, at least, not exactly. They'd undergone something they called the synthesis, which Emmerich described with some difficulty as a kind of voluntary transformation, a becoming something else, that most of them had chosen when their civilization reached a certain point. They'd moved on, in a direction that biological beings in the current era couldn't really perceive or interact with. Most of them. Not all of them chose it, Ferris said carefully. "No," Emmerich agreed. "You didn't." A long pause. "I had reasons to stay." He didn't elaborate. Nobody pushed. There are doors you can sense are meant to stay closed, and this was one of them. What he'd done instead for 12,000 years was watch, travel, intervene occasionally in situations where the intervention could be managed without causing more damage than it prevented. He'd seen civilizations rise. He'd seen them fall. He'd seen the galactic assembly form from the fragmented post-contact chaos of the early expansion era, and he'd watched it grow into something that was, in his assessment, genuinely worth protecting. "You've been protecting us," Reese said, "not a question." "I've been trying to," Emmerich said. "Not always successfully. There are limits to what one person can manage." A pause, even a very old one. At 1347 station time, the Vel Anat scout vessel moved. It didn't come toward us. It moved to a position approximately 200 kilometers out and began broadcasting. Not in standard, not in any assembly language, in a frequency and encoding that our communications array translated slowly and imperfectly into something we could read. What it was broadcasting was, "We know you have it, surrender it, you will not be harmed." It. Not him, not a person, it. I was in the communications center when the translation came through. Lieutenant Ferraro was running the translation array, and she looked up at me with an expression that was trying to decide between anger and fear and hadn't landed anywhere yet. "What do we tell them?" she asked. "Nothing yet," I said. "Don't respond." I went back to the med-bay. Emmerich was sitting up on the table, which he'd been doing more as the day went on. The patient on a bed posture had given way to something more like a person, sitting somewhere they'd chosen to sit. He was looking at nothing in particular, but in the focused way that suggested he was thinking very hard about something specific. "They've started transmitting," I said. "Yes," he said, "I know, I can feel the frequency." At my expression, "The lattice is sensitive to certain signals. It's a feature, not a flaw." "They called you it." Something moved through his face. Not quite anger, more like a very old, very settled exasperation. They've always called me it, or its equivalent in their language. A pause. 12,000 years of being referred to as a storage medium by people who want to open you up and read the files. I sat down in the chair Ferris usually occupied. How many times have they found you? 14, he said. Not without feeling, but with the flat precision of someone who has had a long time to process something terrible. And what happened, those 14 times? Various things. A pause. I'm still here. They are not in most cases. He glanced at me sideways. I'm not helpless, Corporal. I want to be clear about that. I came here to give you a choice, not to ask you to protect me. What's the choice? He turned to look at me directly. Those dark eyes, old in a way that had nothing to do with the lines on a face. The Vel Anat will not stop, he said. They have been searching for 300 years and they will continue. They're not aggressive for the sake of aggression, they're persistent for the sake of purpose. They believe what's in me could give them a decisive advantage over every other species in this sector, and they're not entirely wrong. A pause. The choice is this: I can leave. Now. I can take the conflict with me, draw them away from this region, buy your civilization another century or two of safe development time before you'd encounter them under better prepared circumstances. Or I said. Or I stay, he said, and we deal with this now together. The Vel Anat are not invincible, they're powerful, but they have limits, and I know what those limits are. I've known for 600 years. He paused. I also know things that your assembly's scientific community would find. He searched for the word. Useful, I guessed. Transformative, he said. But I can't share them safely in this situation. The lattice has protections. If I'm compromised before the information can be properly structured for transmission, it defaults to lockdown. Nothing comes out. A pause. Which is what the Vel Anat would discover if they actually managed to capture me, and which is a small, possibly petty satisfaction I have held onto for a very long time. Despite everything, I almost smiled. You've thought about that. Many times, he confirmed. Small comforts. I told Reese. Reese told Tessic. Tessic spent 45 minutes in a closed channel with someone. I don't know who, but the kind of someone who is consulted when decisions are being made that will matter in the history books, and then came back. We'd like him to stay, she said. I relayed this to Rick. He was quiet for a moment. They understand what that means, he asked. That the Vel Anat will not simply leave because they've been asked to. That there will be a confrontation. I think, I said carefully, that the Assembly has been in confrontations before. Not like this. No, I agreed. Not like this, but also you've been managing this alone for 600 years. Maybe it's time you had some help. He looked at me for a long time. You're very forthright, he said finally. Occupational hazard, I said. You spend enough time telling people hard truths about their health, you lose the instinct to soften things. Something shifted in his face then, not the old grief expression, not the patient calm. Something warmer and more current. Something present. All right, he said. We deal with this now. What followed is partly in the official record and partly in my memory, and the two don't always match the same way. The official record covers the next 72 hours in tactical terms. The Vel Anat scout vessel's attempts to force a response. The arrival of an assembly defense unit in response to Tessic's emergency requisition. The three-way communication process in which Rick acted as something between a translator and a strategic advisor, and occasionally a warning system. Because the lattice in his biology apparently had capabilities that extended beyond information storage. The official record does not capture what it was like to watch him work, or what it felt like to understand slowly, across those 72 hours, the scale of what we were dealing with. Not just the Vel Anat, not just the immediate conflict, which was real and serious and ended in a way that I'll describe in a moment. but the larger thing. The fact that for 12,000 years, this man had been carrying the knowledge of an entire civilization inside him, alone, watching the universe move through its ages, waiting for what exactly? I asked him that, at some point during the second night, when the immediate crisis had stabilized enough that we were both sitting in the med bay corridor with cups of something that was called coffee by courtesy only, drinking it in the exhausted way of people who have been awake too long. "What were you waiting for?" I asked. He thought about it. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. "I thought for a long time I thought I was waiting for the right moment to pass it on, the right civilization, the right readiness." He turned his cup in his hands. "But I've met a lot of civilizations, and the right moment kept not arriving. And now—" He was quiet for a bit. "Now," he said, "I think I was waiting to not be alone anymore." A pause, which is a more embarrassing answer than the first one. "It's a better one," I said. The confrontation with the Vel Anat came on the morning of the third day. Not a battle, not exactly. The Assembly Defense Unit had positioned itself, and Emmerich had spent the preceding day doing something I still don't entirely understand, with the cube that his ship had compacted itself into. Working with it, interfacing with it in ways that involved both physical contact and something non-physical that I couldn't observe but could sometimes feel, in the way you can feel changes in atmospheric pressure before a storm. What he was doing, I eventually understood, was building a message. Not a weapon, a message. The Vel Anat, when they came, when their full tactical formation dropped out of transit in the space around Karev 9, 7 vessels arranged in a pattern that was designed to be intimidating and largely succeeded, transmitted again. Emmerich asked to use our communications array to respond. We let him. He spoke for 4 minutes in a language that was not anything in our databases, and not anything I'd heard him use before. It was, I want to describe it accurately. It was like listening to music and mathematics happening simultaneously, patterned and recursive in a way that made the air in the communications center feel different. Then he stopped. There was a long silence from the Vel Anat side. Then the formation changed. The 7 vessels, which had been arranged in the aggressive contact pattern, shifted, separated, moved apart in a way that slowly resolved into something completely different. Retreat. Not rout, not panicked flight. Deliberate, organized withdrawal. They left. What did you say to them? Ferraro asked, in the communications center, staring at the sensor readings that showed the retreat. Emmerich was quiet for a moment. I told them where their ancestors buried their dead, he said. Something they've been trying to find for 400 years. I told them I knew where it was, and that I would tell them not as a transaction, not in exchange for leaving, but because it's their history and they deserve to have it, and that if they wanted to discuss it further, they could reach me through you. He paused. People who are looking for something important stop attacking when you indicate you might help them find it. Even the Vel Anat. Ferris, who had appeared in the communications center doorway at some point, said, "You're going to help them." Yes. Even though they've been doing what people do when they're desperate and grieving and have been looking for something for a very long time, Emmerich said. They made bad choices. Most people do in that situation. He looked at Ferris. It doesn't mean they can't make better ones. There are things I wrote in my incident report and things I kept back. The incident report is in the Assembly archives, filed under a classification level that I'm told has only been used 11 times in the history of the Assembly, and I'm not authorized to discuss it in detail. What I kept back is smaller and more personal, and it feels more true. On the evening of the 4th day, when things had settled enough to feel almost normal, when the defense unit had departed, and the Vel Anat formation was 2 days gone, and the station had more or less resumed its routine, except for the presence of 3 Assembly research xenobiologists who had arrived on a fast courier, and were walking around with the particular expression of people who cannot believe their luck. Emmerich came to find me. I was in the vehicle bay. One of the power crawlers had a hydraulic issue I'd been meaning to look at for a week, and I was finally looking at it, mostly because working with my hands on something straightforward was the best way I'd found to process everything that had happened. He came and stood next to me and looked at the hydraulic system for a while. "You're going to leave," I said, not accusatory, just observation. "Not immediately," he said. "There are conversations I need to have with the research team, with your Dr. Tessick. There's a process for passing on certain things that needs to be done carefully, and it will take time. But eventually, yes, I don't stay in places long. He paused. It becomes complicated. People become attached, or they become afraid, or they become acquisitive. Any of those things is difficult." I handed him the small wrench I'd been using. He looked at it with genuine curiosity, then held it the right way without being shown. "For what it's worth," I said, "we're just glad you came." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, he stopped. "That's not always the response. I want you to know that." "I can imagine. I've been doing this alone for a very long time." "I know," I said. He handed the wrench back. He was quiet again, in the way that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "The lattice," he said finally, "the biological archive. I've been very protective of it for obvious reasons. There are things in it that shouldn't be in the wrong hands, things that could be misused." A pause. "But there are also things that could help, medical advances. Biological science that your current level of knowledge is approximately 200 years from reaching on your own." He looked at me. "I'd like to start there, with the medical applications, with your Dr. Reese and your Ferris and the research team." "Start," I said. "It will take time, years probably, but I'd like to see what happens when it's done right, when information is shared with the right people at the right pace, with the right safeguards." He looked at the hydraulic system. "I've tried keeping things locked away for 12,000 years. I'm ready to try something different." I thought about what to say to that. I thought about Ilyasha, the scientist who'd spent her career defending her findings and retired without consensus. About the fossil record with its anomalous markers. About a civilization that had been old when we were young, that had encoded everything it knew into a single surviving person and sent him forward into time. I thought about the morning 4 days ago when I'd been fighting with a coffee machine, and the world had been simpler. "Okay," I said, "let's start with the medical applications." He stayed for 8 months. In those 8 months, Dr. Reese published 3 papers. Ferris published 2. Tessick's team produced a collaborative work that is still, to my knowledge, the most cited document in assembly biomedical research. The Biological Physics Institute ran experiments based on the lattice compound structures that resulted in breakthrough materials. There were ethical debates. There are always ethical debates when knowledge advances fast, and Emmerich was part of those debates, patiently and carefully, and with the perspective of someone who had watched ethical debates across 12,000 years of civilizations and had some useful things to say about how they tended to go. The Vel Anat came back twice for conversations rather than confrontations. I don't know what came of those conversations. I was present for the first one, not the second. I went back to being a medic. I treated injuries and illnesses and the usual chaos of a forward operating station, and it was ordinary in a way that felt newly precious after everything. Emmerich, when he wasn't with the researchers, spent time just moving through the station, watching, talking to people. He was patient with everyone, even with Private Lassiter, who asked him approximately 40 times whether he could lift something impressive. He had coffee with me most mornings, real coffee, eventually, once I'd solved the machine issue with a part substitution that was technically a warranty violation. The morning before he left, We had coffee together and didn't talk much. When he got up to go, I said, "Will we see you again?" He thought about it in that serious way. He thought about everything. "The universe is large," he said, "but it's also old. Old things have a way of finding each other." He left on a ship that arrived without announcement and looked like nothing I could describe clearly after. I tried to write down what it looked like and kept coming back to the same problem, which is that it didn't look quite like anything else I'd ever seen. He walked to it across the landing pad in the pale yellow Karev 9 morning, and he paused before the door, and he looked back at the station for a long moment, at the med bay, at the comm tower, at the vehicle bay where we talked, at me standing at the entrance. He raised one hand. I raised mine. And then he was gone, and the ship was gone, and the landing pad was empty in the way that things are empty when something that mattered very much was recently there. I still have the incident report. The original draft, not the official one, the one Reese made me file with proper clinical language and appropriate epistemic hedging. The one where I wrote down what I saw and what it felt like and didn't worry about whether it sounded credible. The part I keep coming back to is the blood. The blood outside his body, stopped in a perfect circle, 2 inches from his skin. The first moment I understood I was dealing with something I didn't have a framework for. The thing is, I've been a medic for 15 years now. I've seen a lot of things go wrong with the human body. I've seen it fail and fight and sometimes, surprisingly, survive. What I'd never seen before Emmerich Salah's was a body that had been so thoroughly understood and designed and refined and maintained, that it had transcended the ordinary vulnerability of being alive. He wasn't invincible. He'd said so himself. He had limits. He'd been hurt over the years, the ship, the conflict, the 14 times the Vel Anat had found him. But there was something in the way his biology worked, something in the care that had gone into the building of it, that spoke to a profound belief that life was worth protecting, that whatever you were carrying, whatever you knew, whatever you'd been, it was worth the work of keeping it intact. 12,000 years. One man. The last library of a civilization that had known more than we can currently imagine. And he'd kept it going, not because he had no choice. He could have chosen the synthesis like the others. He'd stayed. He'd kept going through everything. I think about that a lot, in the pale yellow mornings on Karev 9, with the mineral dust air and the recycled oxygen smell, and the coffee machine that still, despite everything, requires a specific firm tap on the left side to run properly. I think about an old civilization's decision to encode everything they were into the most durable medium they could devise, not stone, not crystal, not data, but a person. A living, willing, patient person who would carry it forward. And I think about that person, sitting in the wreckage of a crashed ship with blood stopped in a perfect circle around him, watching us try to figure out how to get him out, giving us all the time we needed, trusting that we would manage. We did manage. That's what humans do. We look at the impossible thing, and we work on it until it's possible, or until we understand it, or until we find a way to make it not impossible anymore. It takes time. It takes stubbornness. It takes the particular kind of faith that you develop when you've spent enough years putting people back together to believe that putting together is possible. But we manage. We always manage. Incident report. Forward Station Karev 9, Corporal Yara Denholm, Medical Division. Amended personal record, dated 6 months after the departure of subject Emmerich Salah's. In the end, I'm not sure what to call what he was. Patient sounds wrong. Contact sounds wrong. Survivor is closer, but even that doesn't fit perfectly. He was exactly what the scanner eventually told us he was, a survivor of an extinct civilization. The last one. The intended last one, the one who stayed behind on purpose, to carry what was worth carrying forward. The scanner was stunned. The medics were stunned. He just waited, patient and old and still, while we caught up. That's its own kind of courage. Maybe it's the hardest kind. Incident closed.